My name is Bob Buckle. I am the chair of the Economic Committee of APEC. As some of you will be well aware, the Economic Committee is charged with the responsibility of advancing APEC's structural reform agenda. The awareness of the importance of structural policies, by that I mean the way in which we design regulations, competition policy, public sector governance and management, corporate governance. There's a growing awareness over the last 2 years that these issues are central to APEC's objective of improving economic welfare and regional economic integration. If you think about what we're trying to achieve with regional economic integration, it is to enhance trade flows in the region, investment flows. So, for example, when we trade, really the key issue is getting goods from the producer right through to the consumer. For example, the asparagus growers in Peru, right through to their markets in the United States and in Asia. So the relationship goes right from the beginning, the origins of production, right through to the households. So therefore, domestic policies clearly matter in our ability to achieve those objectives. How well regulations are designed will affect the incentives of your asparagus growers and of your miners. How well the infrastructure is designed will be influenced by competition policy and regulation. In other words, how efficient is your transport structure and other infrastructure to allow you to engage in trade with other economies is crucial, and they're influenced by domestic policies. There's been a growing awareness of this to the point where for the first time in APEC's history, in nearly 20-year history, in Melbourne this year, earlier this month, there was the inaugural Structural Reform Ministerial Meeting. That was a meeting hosted by the Australian Treasurer Wayne Swan, who invited ministers from the APEC regions to discuss structural policy challenges in the region. That was an outstandingly successful meeting. The issues they discussed there were the political economy challenges of structural policy reform, how to implement good regulations. There was a very good dialogue with business, and there was a joint ministerial statement from that inaugural ministerial meeting. I was invited by Treasurer Swan to attend that meeting, and I was very impressed by the level of engagement from ministers from across the region. Your own minister from Peru, the transport minister, was a very important contributor to that structural reform ministerial meeting and made some outstanding contributions to the meeting. Now, the joint ministerial statement that came out of that ministerial meeting endorsed a number of important initiatives. One of them was to welcome the good practice guide on regulatory reform that had been developed by the Economic Committee. All the ministers recognised that good regulations matter, and this was a very useful guide to how to design good regulation in your home economies. A second agreement was for the Economic Committee to develop a program of practical support to member economies to successfully undertake structural reform. By that, they were really emphasising the importance of capacity building initiatives in the region. And this is something we've been discussing in our Economic Committee meetings that are currently underway at the moment. Another agreement was to a process of voluntary reviews of member economies' institutional frameworks and processes to advance structural reform. So those are three key agreements that came out of the joint ministerial statement earlier this month from the structural reform ministerial meeting. Now let me just comment on some of the developments that have been taking place at the APEC meetings on structural reform initiatives that are led by the Economic Committee. One initiative, which was an initiative developed by Peru, was a seminar on good practices in regulation and the promotion of efficiency in transport infrastructure. This was an initiative that was developed by ISOTRAN, the Peruvian Transport Infrastructure Agency, and the Peruvian officials. And that was an excellent two-day seminar on transport infrastructure issues in the APEC region. Now, why is this one important? Why is this an important issue? Well, transport is a pervasive activity. It touches all markets. So let's go back to our example of the asparagus grower in Peru. In order for them to be able to achieve the scope of the size of the market, to be able to reach markets in other parts of the world, you have to have a very good internal transport structure. You have to have very good rail and road systems. You have to have very good port systems. And that is the point of the seminar, is to how do we actually go about designing policy structures to make sure we have a good infrastructure. It also means that good transport systems bring markets closer together, and it enhances competition in the region. A second important seminar we held, which was hosted by, which was organised by the United States, was a seminar on corporate governance. Now, you will appreciate the significance of good corporate governance. The recent global financial concerns really have highlighted yet again the importance of good corporate governance structures. The subprime mortgage market debacle in the United States is in part related to governance structures in that market, just as was the Asian financial crisis in 1997 and 1998. Bad governance structures in corporates can lead to corporate crises which can have contagion effects around the world if they are big enough, and if they have second round effects, which some of these crises are having. So we've had a very good discussion on how APEC can take a lead in improving governance structures in the corporate and also in small and medium enterprises around the APEC region. And as a result of that, some other initiatives going forward that are going to be led by the Economic Committee include, for example, which we've just endorsed and will be taking to senior officials for endorsement, is an APEC training course on corporate governance, and that's to be held in Vietnam in August in 2009. And another initiative is a seminar on corporate governance and corporate social responsibility for small and medium enterprises, which is to be held in February 2009, and that's to be led by Thailand. Two other initiatives which we have endorsed is the fifth training course on competition policy to be held next year in Chinese Taipei. That's an initiative developed by one of our sub-fora, this Competition Policy and Law Group. And finally, a fourth initiative endorsed by our meeting, which we are currently holding, is a seminar on regulatory reform in enhancing the domestic business environment to be held in Singapore early next year. So that is a quick overview of some of the recent developments that have been taking place under structural policy reform agenda led by the Economic Committee. Those are some of the highlights from the Structural Reform Ministerial meeting held in Melbourne earlier this month, and the Economic Committee will be taking forward those initiatives from that joint ministerial statement. That is a quick summary of two of the seminars we've recently held and some new initiatives the Economic Committee has agreed to for the coming year. So I'm happy to take any questions. The question was about inflation in the APEC region. Let me make clear the organisational structure of APEC. There are really three key committees that deal with APEC's economic agenda and economic issues. One is the Committee on Trade and Investment, which focuses on border barriers to trade, like tariff levels and trade facilitation issues. Another one is the Economic Committee, which I chair, and that focuses on domestic policy structures like regulation and competition policies. And a third key committee is the Finance Officials Committee, which focuses on macro policy issues such as inflation. Now let me draw a connection between these. At the moment, the rapid growth in the region is putting some inflationary pressures on a lot of economies in the region. There's no doubt about that. The way in which many developed economies have tackled that is by running good monetary policies. Monetary policies that are targeted at trying to maintain inflation through changes in interest rates, for example. That's the common practice. But at the same time, one has to ask the question, what are the sort of shocks and events that are leading to higher inflation? And some of them is the rapid growth that's impinging on food prices and commodity prices. And that's where the work of the Economic Committee can help to try and encourage efficient markets and competitive processes in those areas to help ameliorate the effects of demand pressures on those prices and on those types of commodities. So our issues work to complement the issues of the finance ministers or finance officials process to help ameliorate the inflationary effects, but also when you do get these adverse shocks, good domestic policies help you ride through them much better. Well, one of the interesting features of APEC, of course, is that we're a group of 21 economies with quite different economic structures and different stages of development. The seminar on corporate governance made it one of the resounding messages that came through is that good corporate governance is important for all economies, and that good corporate governance can enhance regional economic integration. For example, good corporate governance in say, Peru will enhance the attractiveness of foreign firms to invest and do business here. Similarly, good corporate governance in some of the other economies means that trade is more likely to flow to them, and so will financial flows. So one of the clear messages is that good corporate governance matters to all of these economies, and that it enhances regional economic integration. A second message that comes through is that, however, that the circumstances are different, and that the way in which we go about encouraging good corporate governance will likely vary across these different economies. Some economies have lots of small and medium enterprises and not many large corporations. Some of them have more larger corporations. So the challenges of getting good corporate governance do vary across these economies. And that is why Thailand and Vietnam, for example, are running these seminars and workshops next year to increase awareness of the importance of corporate governance and to identify the special circumstances which the various economies are in, to see what's the best way to go about firstly encouraging good corporate governance and designing good corporate governance to fit their requirements. Having said that, there are some good practice guides available from the OECD and the World Bank, and they were here during the weekend on Sunday, I think it was, where we had the corporate governance seminar, and they talked about the good practice guides which economies might like to use, and there are some common principles there which I think most economies would find they would be comfortable with and would be very helpful in designing their governance structures. Well, look, the Economic Committee hasn't discussed those particular markets, those markets in particular. What we are really trying to do is encourage economies to follow good policy practices in their economies, so that they are better able to meet those challenges. It may well be that the leaders do take up these issues, and that's something for us to wait and see. I'm sure it will be of interest to them, but our committee focuses on the design and implementation of good practice, good policy design and good policy practice, and we don't focus specifically on individual markets like petrol prices and so on. But as I said earlier, good design of regulations and competition policy helps deal with those challenges. Let me just repeat the question. What have we done? What are we doing to improve economies' performances in our meetings? Maybe I could use an example. What our economic committee does, as I said before, is trying to share knowledge and experiences about good policies in the region. Now, let me give you an example. In my own country, in New Zealand, we went through a dramatic period of economic reforms during the late 1980s and early 1990s. And what we did is adopted changes to our regulations, to our trade policy, to our competition policy, to labour market regulations. We did that because our income relative to other economies in the region and in the OECD was actually falling. We were one of the wealthiest countries in the world at the turn of the last century, and even in the 1950s and 1960s. But gradually over time, because of bad policy design, our income relative to the OECD was falling. We were above the average, and well above the average for the OECD in the early 1970s, and we declined by the 1980s. We were about 85% of the average income level in the OECD. As a consequence of that, we made some policy reforms, and we are now improving our income relative to the OECD as a result of those policy reforms. Australia is another example that went through policy reforms, and it has recovered even more dramatically than New Zealand has. Its ranking in the OECD fell from something like 5th in the 1970s down to about 18th, and now it's up to about 6th as a result of these policy reforms. Chile went through some policy reforms. What we're doing in this economic committee is drawing lessons from those reform processes, identifying best practice and sharing that knowledge with each other, and helping economies implement good policies so that they also can share in the opportunities to have higher income growth and higher living standards. And in fact, Peru is going through that process now. As a result of your reforms in the early 1990s, you have seen in the last decade and a half a dramatic improvement in your income levels on average, and living standards have changed quite markedly. So that's really what we're aiming to do in the Economic Committee. It's a long game. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a long game. And I think I said to some of the media in Peru in February, you can think, I quoted Rachel Hunter when she was talking about her different hair shampoo products. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen.